Greetings and welcome to episode 43 of the Sustaining the Herd podcast brought to you by Settje Agri-Services and Engineering of Raymond, Nebraska. I'm Andrew Wadle, and I'm joined in the studio with my co-host, Brock Vitek.
Hey there, Andrew.
And we're also joined in the studio today with our special guest, Zach Settje, COO of Settje Agri-Services and Engineering.
Glad to be here.
Thanks for joining us, Zach. And we'd like to say thank you. Welcome back to our existing or past listeners, and we really appreciate the feedback that we get and the feedback that you're getting some things out of our podcast when it comes to sustainability and just kind of, hey, agriculture is the greatest recycling system the world has ever known. And those are the types of things that we like to talk about. But specifically when it comes to, for our new listeners, when it gets right down to it, our episodes usually weave in and out of really three particular topics within sustainability. And the first one is what we normally think about when it comes to sustainability, and that is protecting the air and the water, keeping the bad things out of the water that we drink and the air that we breathe. The second part of sustainability is doing more with less, resource efficiency, and that is a huge part of sustainability. The third facet of sustainability that we talk about is sustainability of businesses. We have to have strong ag businesses with quality professionals so that we can support the industry the best we can. And when it comes to feeding and clothing and in a lot of cases fueling the world. So with that, again, Zach, thank you very much for joining us, and please tell us a little bit more about your day-to-day at Settje Agri-Services and Engineering.
Sure, yeah. Well, I started at Settje Ag, 7 years ago now, full-time. Started out in construction project management, went into more of the design and consulting side, ran a bunch of our international design and consulting projects for a while, and then worked my way back into construction management again. My day-to-day role here is, I would say, a hybrid of overseeing some of our larger projects and overseeing kind of just general operations of the business from admin side, but mostly from field and performance side of what we do on the construction side.
Excellent. Thanks, Zach. And I want to make sure we mention that this is your second time on the podcast. For all of our listeners who may have joined us recently or not been around since the beginning of Sustaining the Herd, Zach was one of our first guests. So we're excited to have you back by what I would say, or what I would call popular demand. So Nick Maskey and Travis Casperson have some competition now. You too are back by popular demand. So with all of that, Zach, I'd like to dive into our topic for the day, something that I'd say you are one of the foremost experts in the livestock production industry these days, and that is roller compacted concrete, or what a lot of folks might know as RCC for short. So to start out with that topic, I'd like to ask you, for those who have no familiarity at all, what is roller compacted concrete and what is its application specifically in beef cattle feedlots?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's a long history of RCC. I think it's important to note that we, Settje Ag, or the feedlot industry, did not invent or discover RCC. A variety of conflicting opinions, but it's been used for a very long time in industrial and military applications as well. And typically with a paver situation. And so, we started getting into RCC 7 or 8 years ago here in Nebraska on feedlots, and the mix and the principle of the concrete itself is the same. The application of it, the install process, the equipment used, the QA/QC process involved is somewhat different. The install process itself is almost entirely different. And so when we started getting into RCC, we didn't have to reinvent the wheel with new mix designs, new plants, new XYZ pieces of equipment. Really, all we had to do was figure out how to make it fit a feedlot, how to install it efficiently, how to get it on the ground correctly, and then how to test it during install and after install to make sure that it met the same parameters of what I would call more of an industrial application.
Very good. And for our returning listeners, you've certainly heard Andrew and I talk about RCC from time to time. And Zach, you may have briefly mentioned it in the first time that you joined us, but thanks for sharing all of that. I think you hit the nail on the head there. As like you said, Settje and the feedlot industry did not invent RCC. However, there have been quite a few things to figure out when it comes to project execution and actually getting this in to feedlots.
Yeah, and I could back up for a second even and say, RCC, for those who don't know anything or very much about concrete at all, the mix itself is nearly identical to ready-mix concrete, just with less water in it. So significantly less water. So you're putting out a less than zero slump at this point. It looks like a pile of wet gravel with the color of your gray cement powder. So, when it comes down to it, what's coming out of the plant is different by volume and different by shape, but by actual mix, it's not much different than traditional ready mix.
Right. And the other thing I think that's kind of important to note, Zach, if I'm not mistaken, is because it doesn't require reinforcement, it's quicker to deploy, since you're really dumping it out and then grading it and compacting it.
Yeah. Yeah, the installation process is significantly quicker. You can put down a lot more material in a short amount of time through the install process with RCC, whether that's with a paver or with more of a dozer application like we do, where we install it with a GPS guided dozer. The process is much quicker, A, because you're transporting large volumes of material basically as fast as your plant will make it, and B, yes, because you don't have reinforcement. And I would say with RCC, it's not that it doesn't require reinforcement. It's that you make a mix design that is as strong as something with reinforcement in it. But really, when it comes down to it, you can't actually install reinforcement, i.e. rebar, in RCC when it's being installed. It's just not physically impossible. And so you have to make up for some of that with a proper mix design, proper testing protocol, and so forth.
And Zach, just to give our listeners an idea of the, scale of these projects and how quickly you can put this down for these large projects that you're currently managing, how many square feet a day of RCC is being installed on a good day when things are dry and the sun's shining and it's 70 degrees?
Yeah, on a good day, we're putting down over 2,000 cubic yards of material, which is, if I boil that down to a square footage, which is kind of how we measure it because of the nature of what we're doing, where we're designing and building feedlots and counting square footage as headspace. That's kind of how we measure it. But when you're coming down to 2,000 plus yards a day, you're reaching north of 110, 120,000 square foot a day. So you're covering a lot of ground really fast, quite literally a couple of acres of install per day.
2 acres per day-ish.
Mm-hmm.
At least.
And then what would that work out to in headspace?
So if you had 120,000 square foot, it's kind of a variable dependent on what I'll probably give the disclaimer here a couple times that I'm not a veterinarian. And so I can't prescribe to you what the perfect square footage is for the animals you feed, the ration you feed them, and the climate that you feed them in. A basic parameter for square footage on RCC is 125 square foot per head. So you're putting down just shy of 1,000 headspace of concrete per day.
Yeah, I see.
That's a lot.
Yeah, and with the disclaimer duly noted that you are not a veterinarian, you've been around cattle feeding all your life and talked to cattle feeders day in and day out. And so, can you just give us an idea for just some design considerations in when it comes to, let's do it two ways. Let's just say greenfield site, as well as if we were to be doing like a renovation job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, in most all scenarios in construction, it's not unique to RCC or even feedlots. A greenfield site is easier to design around when you're planning a new project. We're looking at pen slopes of anywhere from 1 to 2.5%. I've seen them up to 3 without negative detriments to cattle. That's on RCC lots, not just on dirt. You go steeper than 3 and you've got a few problems you're asking for there. But what we've seen with this on where you're installing RCC is you've got anywhere from that 1 to 3% slope, and then you're looking back at renovations of pens, and basically it comes down to when you're renovating pens, redoing feedlots, you have to figure out what slope you can live with, because a lot of these earthen pen feedlots are 3, 4, even 5% slope, specifically in Nebraska. Now, the further south you go, the less steep they are because of rainfall and climate factors. But there's a sweet spot there, because when you start messing with pen slope, you're essentially rebuilding most of, if not all, of your feedlot space. You start rebuilding pen slope, you're adding new fence, you're potentially changing water lines and water tank locations, and that renovation can rack up in cost pretty quickly. So, when we have someone come and ask us to look at a feedlot on a redesign, and they just say they want RCC, they don't want to redo anything else in their lot, or very minimal disruption, we have to basically go through and assess pen slopes, and then figure out, one row of pens might be 2%, might be 3%. And you say, yeah, we can live with this. Some of them might be 4 or 5. There may be areas that are steeper than others. And so you kind of have to go through that case by case on a renovation.
Right. So whereas 5% would be, I'm picking 5%, 5% would be acceptable on just a conventional dirt lot. On concrete, it would just be too steep. And
yeah, you're asking for a couple of things. A lot of people ask about ice in the winter on RCC. We haven't seen much of that, mainly because of the stocking density. So when you get that many cattle in a small space, they're just constantly stirring it up, almost to a point, keeping it heated or moving it around. Not to say you won't get ice accumulation during a severe ice storm, but just general ice accumulation is not a huge concern on these RCC pens. But once you start getting in those steeper, 3+% on pens, you actually just start worrying about cattle traction and slippage. If you go out there and a cowboy scares half the pen and they run across, well, if it's too steep, they're slipping and sliding, and you're asking for animal health issues left and right after that.
Right. You mentioned stocking density. Where do we go in RCC from a conventional lot to RCC? How are we changing our stocking densities?
Yeah, it's kind of subject to where you are in the world. So, if we look at Northeast Nebraska as an example, or North Central Nebraska, your stocking density is probably 300 to 350 square foot per head. So when you're going to RCC, you can essentially cut that in half. But then if you talk about renovating pens that are in the past have been, more of a long, skinny rectangle to an RCC where you're stocking denser, you're wasting pen space. You're wasting old pen space. So the conversion in those areas isn't from 300 to 125. It's probably 300 to 200 or something like that. There's a sweet spot there. As you get into kind of central, southwest Nebraska, the conversion's a little more clear cut, especially if your pens aren't as steep and you're just renovating the pen surface. And then as you get into, southern Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, you're looking at basically a 1-to-1 conversion on head space and stocking density, where some yards in Texas are stocking at 150 to 200 square foot per head. So you're gaining a little bit, but not exact.
Zach, I see where you're going with that. For our listeners who may not be all that familiar with how stocking density is calculated, could you explain just a bit about how it's a function of both pen area or square footage in addition to linear feet of bunk space per head? And that's how you could maybe end up with some, say, wasted pen space in a longer, skinnier pen where the feet of bunk and the square footage of the pen aren't proportionate.
Yeah. No, that's a good point, Brock. Basically, when we go and look at old pens or earthen pens, not one and the same, but one or the other, right? Usually longer, rectangle shaped, 300-400 foot long, and constrained by bunk space at that point. So if you're leaving your fences where they are, you're basically maximizing your RCC square footage, which may not even cover the whole pen. You may only go a half or 2/3 of the depth of the pen. And then, if you were at 8 to 12 inches of bunk space, maybe you can go down to 5 to 7 and gain a little bit of headspace in that. But ultimately, when you add concrete, you're decreasing your stocking density, but you can only decrease it so far before you're overcrowding your bunks significantly. And bunk space per head it's a quagmire of the industry. I think what we're seeing is a rule of thumb of 7 A lot of people make it work at 6, and most people are nervous to try or experiment with anything less than 6 inches of bunk space per head.
Yeah, and I think Zach, we oftentimes still things right down to the people in town who listens to our episode, and that is the people who aren't familiar with cattle feeding. And I think it's important to note that we talk about bunk space for the primary reason of just putting it into terminology everybody understands. Need to have enough seats at the table, so to speak, when it comes to eat. And so it's vitally important that there is enough space for all the cattle to sufficiently and stress-free, or to eat in a stress-free manner.
Yep.
Good point, Andrew. Good analogy there. So, Zach, in the beginning of the episode, you mentioned that project execution and figuring out how to get RCC on the ground at feedlots and done at an acceptable standard of quality has been where Settje has done a lot of learning and been able to deliver value for the industry. I'd like to talk a bit more about that now. Andrew's made an analogy. I think I'll make another one. Hopefully this is reasonable. I could hand 2 people each a box of Betty Crocker cake mix. And I should make the disclaimer, we're not sponsored by Betty Crocker, to my knowledge. Hand 2 people a box of Betty Crocker cake mix, and a couple hours later, there could be 2 very different cakes that come out of the oven. Unless someone is standing there supervising the cake baking, making sure that the directions are being followed, and there's a certain standard of quality involved. I like to think that installing RCC on feedlots might have some similarities to that. Could you walk us through how you design and install RCC projects with quality in mind, paying attention to your QA and QC practices?
Yeah, I didn't know where you're going with that analogy, Brock, but
I don't know if I knew either.
I ended up appreciating it, so I like that one.
Hey, I appreciate your appreciation,
Brock
Zach.
and I like to eat, and so it all kind of boils down. All the analogies come back to food.
Andrew and I like eating lunch.
Well, yeah. So I think there's kind of two segments of this, right? There's the pre-project or the pre-installation preparation QA QC process, and then there's during and after. The pre-project piece is extremely important. So for those who don't know, with RCC, every single time we're bringing us a RCC plant on site, we're delivering aggregate to it. Cement powder is being delivered. We're metering in water. We're mixing it on site. We're delivering it on site. So you're not ordering RCC from a local ready mix plant in a town 20 miles away. So when you have localized aggregates, you're pulling samples of those aggregates as you're making a mix design on the front end, basically to figure out what inclusion of powder you need. And also, is the aggregate sufficient? Across Nebraska, on all the projects I've worked on, anything in the Platte River Valley, you're seeing pretty consistent 47B sand gravel mix. Very easy to predict. You go north, you go south, you get into, central Nebraska, north central, or southwest Nebraska, the product's totally different. And so you're basically including a different rate of cement powder as you're mixing it. So we have to basically figure out what those sources of aggregate are, I'll save some of the details here, but run a variety of tests on them to make a mix design that meets your local aggregate spec. That's kind of the front end. Make sure you have the right materials there and make sure you have the right mix before you even pull the plant onto the site. The other part is subgrade preparation. So, and it's no secret in feedlots, there's usually a hard pan, and the hard pan is not just clay. It's usually an earthen mix of clay and manure and organic matter, right? So the problem you have with a hard pan of organic matter is that it will expand and contract either with freeze thaws or with rain and droughts. You can't put RCC on top of that. As hard as it seems, it just does not hold up long term, and you'll watch your concrete just break apart for years after that. So basically, when we're renovating pens, we're removing the organic matter. So I've seen anywhere from, I would say 6 to 18 inches of manure being removed off of pens. And when you're doing that, you think if you're removing 18 inches of manure off pens to go put RCC in, you're only putting in 6 inches of RCC. So you're going to lower your whole pens, all your feedlot pens by a foot? Most likely not. So you're going to end up importing dirt to basically rebuild that surface to put concrete on top of. So getting a proper subgrade and then doing the proper compaction tests, moisture density tests, running it against an actual proctor, that is paramount, because I've seen, I would say 90+% of the failures we see in RCC are not the concrete itself, it's what's underneath it.
Yeah.
So that's kind of everything leading up to the install. The install process, there's a lot of nuances and details here, but we're running a variety of tests throughout the install process as it's being rolled through the day and then through the following evening to basically test that it's meeting density, that we're getting compaction that we need on that product. That's going to be our first test that we run to say this RCC is good. And you're running that test, an hour after it's basically final rolled. So you're running that test, you're comparing it to what your proctor says, you're basically figuring out, is this being installed as we spec'd it out? Okay, you got that, let's say it worked. Then you go to the last step, which is going and pulling core samples at 3, 7, sometimes 14, sometimes 28 days to project out break strengths on what that RCC is curing. So at a 3-day break, we can test and basically say, yeah, this is going to pass, or it's marginal, but we'll see how it goes. At a 7-day break, you can almost always tell if the product's going to pass. And if it's still not passing, we'll give it up to a 14-day break. We'll pull another core, and then we'll test that. If it's still failing at 14, it's most likely getting tore out because it's just not curing to its full extent.
It's not going to get there.
We'll pull 28-day cores at places as well, but the biggest challenge with 28-day cores is, when we build RCC pens, the only thing we're doing after that is setting water tanks and building fence. So 28 days after you put RCC down, a lot of times your customer already has cattle on the pens, and you're not going to go pull cores out of, manure-covered RCC pens. So we're basically pulling as many as we can on the front end. We're testing those, watching break strengths, projecting them out, and I would say 99% of the time we have 7-day breaks. We know right where that product's going to cure at 28.
This, I think Brock's analogy, Betty Crocker, almost kind of, in some ways, I feel like it kind of falls apart only because it's not like everybody has the same ingredients day to day. And so I think
that's true.
This kind of makes you like the mad scientist of concrete, Zach, because you're taking what you have on that particular day, different shape, different moisture, different, but yet the output has to be the same.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I'd also throw in here the disclaimer too is we at Settje Ag are not pulling cores, because for you to contract us to put RCC down and then us to give you all the results on Settje Ag letterhead that say, heck yeah, this passed. It's just not fully trustworthy, right? We're pulling in a third party to test all of this material so that anytime you're getting test results, it's coming from a certified geotech lab and technicians who know what they're doing to give you those results. So I think that's important to note too, is like, I'm not going to go pour a bunch of concrete for you and then tell you how great it is. I'm going to pour a bunch of concrete for you and hire someone else to come in and actually make sure it's there and then test and then tell you the test results.
Independent party.
Yeah, it's a transparent process, really.
Yeah, this is not cowboy concrete installation. There's some science and rigor to this.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've clearly you've overseen a lot of RCC going down and meeting the right strengths and whatnot. And so you mentioned cattle getting on that concrete. What are we hearing from the field, really? Because that's what it gets right down to. I'm sure the cattle feeders, they're interested in making sure that it's strong and it stays and it's durable. But at the end of the day, they want to get paid, and the RCC's got to do its thing. So what are they seeing?
Yeah, so I can't speak fully to what the cattle performance results are. What I can tell you is that the customers that we have that do RCC and do it repeatedly over and over are very, very data driven. They're not investing millions or tens of millions of dollars into concrete just to see if it works, right? They're pulling results off of closeouts and saying, yeah, this works. As for specifics on how those cattle perform, I can't tell you because I might know a little bit, but I can't disclose all of that from other people. So that's one, but I think probably the more obvious ROI on RCC, or easier to measure, is just the maintenance. So, with concrete, you're not rebuilding pens every winter. You're not re-importing dirt. You're not fixing holes that cattle dig. You're also not pulling out manure, which is anywhere from 40 to 70% ash or non-organic matter, right? You're pulling out manure that is essentially pure. So you're decreasing the volume of material you're moving in and out of that yard by 50% in some cases, if not more. And that's huge when you're talking about machines and man hours, just to decrease your maintenance costs. Now, what's a little different that I think some people have learned, and we definitely have too as well after building some of these yards and working with customers, is the maintenance of these RCC pens is a lot different. In an earthen lot, you're going in, you're cleaning pens on whatever schedule you've set, but it's not as frequent as what I'm about to tell you on RCC. Whereas RCC, you're going in there every 7 to 14 days, maybe 10 to 20 days, depending on your schedule. And you're cleaning off the top few inches of that manure. You're hauling it out of the yard, or you're piling it at least and then getting it out of the pen space. Because what you find is if you don't clean that and you have 6 inches of pure manure sitting inside your feedlot, and you get a big rain event or you get a big freeze thaw and snow event, it turns into a soup. Like there's no way to handle that material. If you've got 6 inches of manure in a pen and you get a 1-inch rain, you can say goodbye to cleaning that pen for a couple of weeks, because it's that material that you can't pump out, even if you had a place to pump it from. It's too thick, but it's too sloppy and thin to pick it up in a payloader bucket and put it in a side dump and haul it out. So keeping that manure pack as minimal as possible is really key. And so you're going into those pens a lot more frequently, but you're spending a heck of a lot less time in them just pulling that material out. You go in, you clean a pen, and I've literally seen it done 10, 15 minutes. They clean a pen, haul the manure out, onto the next one. So they're just cycling through that yard, cleaning it more often.
Absolutely. Yeah. And something I've noticed, Zach, compared to traditional dirt or earthen pens, you're not going to see cattle with, in a manure slop pit with manure halfway up their legs potentially after a big rain in the summer. It just, even though conditions might still get difficult if you're not on top of things, I'd like to think that it is still more manageable at the end of the day, and gives you more options to make sure that the conditions are what they need to be for the cattle.
Yeah. Well, they always have a base to reach to sit on. You're not getting sinkholes in the backs of the pens like you typically would see on earthen pens in chronic wet periods. So.
And what about bedding, Zach? How are they bedding RCC pens?
Most of what I've seen bedding, a little bit of straw, mostly corn stalks. Not a lot of bedding in the summer. Sometimes when you get new calves out there, you'll put bedding out there. It kind of gives them a term of comfort, going from wherever they came from, not a feedlot, into a feedlot. They'll put bedding in for new calves. And then they'll bed during the winter, just as a kind of a warmth and comfort factor. We have seen data that says, surfaces of pens on RCC is actually cooler in the summer when you get a little bit of manure on top of it, because you get a lot less moisture retention, which basically holds your heat overnight. So it's kind of like a desert effect, right? It cools down more at night. So that's one thing there. And then, bedding mostly with corn stalks. There's been a few people experimenting with other types of bedding. I'm not sure that, I don't know how much promise or practice they have yet, but majority of it's corn stalks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just throughout the most recent parts of the conversation here, there's a theme coming through for me, and I'd like to see if you guys agree. And I think that RCC is a tool for cattle producers, for cattle feeders. I think some folks, when this really started to first become adopted in the industry here in the Midwestern U.S., some people thought, oh man, this is the next silver bullet for the industry. This takes care of all our pen maintenance problems. It's like Christmas in July. Not necessarily, based on some of the things you've just described, Zach, but as I think you've highlighted, it is a tool that could help producers to successfully, sustainably, and profitably produce beef.
Mm-hmm.
But it needs to be managed appropriately as a tool in their toolbox.
Yeah. That's a good way to sum it up. I mean, I've seen producers with RCC pens that, after the first turn of cattle, they changed their management strategy drastically, not by, throwing a bunch more money at it or throwing a bunch more manpower at it, just changing how they do things. Frequency, really, the frequency of cleaning those pens is one of the most key. So they kind of adjust to that, and the results speak for themselves after that. But it is a totally different management strategy than an earthen lot pen. And I would throw in one thing I haven't talked about really is we actually do quite a few new builds and renovations where we're basically doing extended aprons. So we're not going all in on all RCC in the pens. We're going 40, 50, 60 foot back from the bunk with concrete. And then the second half or the second 2/3 of the pen is still dirt. And a lot of people like that because cattle spend a majority of their time near their water tank and their bunk. And so when they're doing that, they're depositing a majority of their manure up front. So it does ease up on your pen cleaning requirements while still kind of meeting a sweet spot of economics of not spending oodles of dollars on concrete if you're unsure that it's going to return it for you.
So Zach, if you were to, be advising someone interested in doing an RCC project, for a feedlot, what would be 3 things that you would recommend for them to be cognizant of?
Well, I think the first one is, most of the conversations and questions we get are on renovations, right? So it's really, okay, the cost of RCC. That's one cost to your project. We really need to assess how far this is going to go, like with pen slopes, with rebuild of water tanks, because the thing we haven't talked about is if you increase your stocking density by 1.5 or 2x, your water network infrastructure, tank space is probably not sufficient either. And so we've made some renovations and adjustments there. We've also redone water systems with RCC. So I'd say is like, if you hear, and I'm not going to give you any quotes on this podcast, but if you hear people talking about the cost of RCC, you really need to dig in a little further and make sure that's going to be your only cost, because I think a lot of times we get down the path on these renovations and people want to just do concrete, and it turns out that you can't just do concrete. So that was the first thing. The second, I think, you really have to, and I'm again, I'll give that other disclaimer, I'm not a veterinarian or a nutritionist. You really have to know your data of what is coming out of cattle on closeouts, what is returning for you, because I think when you put down an investment like RCC, it can be pretty quick to get lost in the weeds of, okay, was it this cycle of weather? Was it this change in ration? Was it these other cattle I imported from this place that changed my closeouts versus I know exactly what I'm putting in my dirt lot, and now I've got RCC pens to compare to. That's really the biggest thing. You have to be able to measure it.
Very good. Well, Zach, I have one last question I'd like to ask you before we wrap up here. As need you to put your thinking hat on and look to the future as I ask, what's next in the world of RCC?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a surprise or a secret at this point. It's kind of taking the feedlot industry by storm, but there's plenty of skepticism out there, and rightfully so. I mean, we've tore out a lot of concrete. We've put down magnitudes more than we've tore out, and the rest of it's all holding up. So I'd make that disclaimer, but you have to do it wrong a couple times here and there to be able to do it right. And I think, the trend is going to continue that people will add concrete. Will they add extended aprons? Will they do full pens? Will they do green fields? Will they do renovations? I'm not sure it matters. I think it's more about the fact that they're going to add solid surfaces to earthen pens moving forward. And really what that holds, or what that opens the door for, and we've worked on several of these projects now, all in their infancy, is it opens the door to anaerobic digestion. And I know you guys know a whole lot more about that world than I do even, but because when you're collecting manure off of concrete, in effect, you're doing the same exact thing that a dairy does. And there's plenty of digesters in the dairy world. Now there's a whole list of contingencies there of the consistency of the manure and weather events and size of cattle and ration and all that. But ultimately, it's it's not a proven thing that you can feed manure into a digester from an earthen pen lot. There's been experiments tried and failed on that. I would also say it's not a proven thing that you can take it off of RCC and do it. But in essence, there is no reason why you can't, because you have pure manure coming off of concrete in that instance. Then it's just a comparison of the methane potential of manure of beef versus dairy and how that works. So,
yep, very well said. Yep.
Yep. You said exactly what Andrew and I like to hear. That's great.
Well, yeah, and I think that in everything that you just said, Zach, it just speaks to the fact that the topic of RCC is squarely it's a sustainability. It's a factor in sustainability, because
absolutely,
we said the first thing is protecting the air and the water, and so while RCC is making it more possible to do anaerobic digestion. Check. If we're not talking data specifically, but we know that cattle are performing better, and so what does that mean? Cattle are getting fatter faster, right? And so that's number two. That's doing more with less. That's resource efficiency, and when you put that together, it affects the businesses. It helps our cattle feeding industry to be strong. So it's a RCC equals sustainability.
Certainly does. You summed it up well, Andrew. And with that, Zach, I just want to say thank you again for being our guest today. This has been a really enjoyable conversation, and I think our listeners will say the same.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be on again.
And to all of our listeners, both new and returning, thank you for joining us for this conversation with Zach today. We are very excited for this to be the first episode of Season 3 as we kick off a new season, and we'll be back with you again in a couple of weeks. Until then, thanks for joining the herd today.